Throughout 2589, the Star League was still recoiling in horror at the loss of life on New Vandenberg. The Reunification War had been raging for over 12 years, more than twice the length of even the worst estimates from the war's planning stages. Everyone by this point was exhausted, but the end goal was in sight. The Outworlds Alliance and Majesty of Canopus had surrendered, and the Rimworld's Republic and Taurian Concordat had been pushed back to their capital worlds. There was still 7 years left to go. In the Rimworlds, General Nathan Isaacson continued to sweep up the scattered RWA, targeting first the Amaris family's personal resort world of Ilium. The Tartan Brigade put up a respectable resistance until the fight closed in on the capital city of Troy. Shortly after, the defenders surrendered, not wanting to see the city damaged. First Consul Gregory Amaris would commend the unit's commander after the war on ensuring his property wasn't damaged. Elsewhere on the front, the planets of Vedern, Malaga and Marisura also fell to the Star League. In the Taurian Concordat, Mirantha Calderon was making the difficult decision to continue the war. She felt trapped by the fact that so many millions had already given up their lives in the name of freedom, but knew full well that she had no hope of victory. The TDF soldiered on regardless, raising 2 Hyades Special Service regiments between 89 and 2590 that would specialise in fighting on the many interstellar bodies present in Flannagan's Nebula. Shortly after General Forlow departed from the Taurian Concordat, a year after his victory at New Vandenberg, his replacement, Lord Damien Onaga, General of the Starguard Corps, arrived to spend the holiday season with the remnants of the once mighty Task Force Taurus. A year of rest had allowed them to replace some of the vast losses suffered under Forlow, but had done little to improve morale. He assumed command of the front on January 1st, 2590, and took stock of his situation. He knew that to win the war he would need to breach the Hyades cluster, but also knew that such a fight had the potential to be as costly to the SLDF as New Vandenberg had been. In order to gain his many green recruits valuable experience, as well as to improve the overall mood of his army, he chose softer targets outside of Flannagan's Nebula that the TDF had all but abandoned. 3 planets presented themselves as fit for purpose: Desolate Plains, Brockway and Medali. With his primary goal not to subjugate the populations, but to give his units experience, he moved 4 of the corps under his command to the worlds and cycled through the many divisions, giving each a short spell on the surface. To make such manoeuvres possible, Ian Cameron had finally authorised the deployment of the elite Starguard Corps, within which was his son Nicholas, now serving as regimental colonel for the 10th Royal Cavalry. Only the 64th Royal Brigade was retained as the First Lord's personal guard. The campaigns were slow but purposeful, the only notable event being the final defeat of the Taurian Third Corps, most of which had been destroyed back in Wexworth's day. The 3 planets fell in October, November and December respectively. 2590 was a busy year for Operation Mailed Fist. The occupations of Herbania, Mara, Ormston and Wotan were largely uneventful. It looked as if they would have similar luck when they landed on Gwynedd in April, but things soon turned ugly. The loyalist forces on the planet had welcomed the SLDF, but in so doing had turned the local populace against them. It took 11 months to finally quell the riots. The last 2 worlds in the Finnmark and Timbuktu provinces fell to the Marek and Steiner battle groups in the mid-year. Sluis was something of an anticlimax for Duke Solage, whose arrival in May was accepted with indifference by the locals. Luanda, in contrast, had been caught in a civil war that predated the reunification conflict by several years. None of the various factions were particularly interested in doing business with the Star League, but eventually a shaky peace was restored. All forces now redeployed for the push towards Apollo. The Taurian Concordat had but one stronghold left come 2591. Nothing of any significance existed beyond the borders of their homeworlds, and preparations were well underway to fortify them in every conceivable manner. The last Taurian battle mech unit, the 143rd Concordat Chasseurs, entered service with the Taurian Guard Corps, and what few warships that remained of their once grand navy were organised under Marshal Gisela Cardenas. Lord Damien Onaga was faced with a difficult decision. Flannagan's Nebula was a true nightmare of hundreds of swirling stars, thousands of planets, planetoids and moons, and many thousands of times that number of roaming asteroids and comets. He could, conceivably, use the stolen coordinates captured on dozens of Taurian warships to jump as many fleets right to the heart of the Hyades cluster. The problem was that he didn't need surveillance to know that the kind of defences those jump points would have had the potential to obliterate his task force's entire naval consignment. Warships, dropships, uncountable legions of fireships, orbital battle stations, retrofitted service yards, turrets, emplacements, mines, remote detonated nuclear bombs, and unknowable other horrors lay ahead of him. He would not brute force his way through to the end as his predecessor Forlow might have done. and so began the most expansive training program in Starleague history. The numbers of trained Zero-G personnel he would require was well beyond that of his Marine detachment. While the bulk of his army was busy elsewhere, 4th Corps and the newly arrived Starguard were busy practicing in the outer reaches of the new Vandenberg system for the upcoming assault. Onaga's plan was to methodically dismantle the various defence rings around Taurus, gradually tightening the noose as he went. The invasion was set to commence on April 2nd. Across the Inner Sphere, within the halls of the Triad on Tharkad, trouble was brewing among the Estates General, the governing body at the heart of the Lyran Commonwealth. The Archon had been away from court for almost 10 years. Her interim replacement, her son Kevin Steiner was not up to the task, and the nation had never fully recovered from the economic collapse in the run-up to the Reunification War. It was against this backdrop that Graf Henry Graham, Speaker for the Estates General and member of the Steering Committee, rose to prominence. His rhetoric pushed for the Lyran Commonwealth to distance itself from the Starleague, potentially even to withdraw altogether. A special session to discuss the issue was called on March 13th, but it could not begin due to the absence of the heir apparent, Kevin. When his whereabouts could not be determined, word of a kidnapping started to spread. The LIC determined early on that his advisors, the Dukes of Skye and Tamar, were not to blame, but they remained the leading suspects in the eyes of the public. A failed assassination attempt on Selvin Kelswar prompted the Duke to return to Tamar, and Aldo Lestrade went back to Skye soon after, thus cementing them in the public opinion as the culprits. On the 25th of March, 4 days after the attempt on Kelswar's life, Henry Graham reluctantly stepped forward as leader of the Commonwealth and promised to go ahead with his plan for a vote on leaving the Starleague. Unaware of events on her homeworld, the Archon was leading a joint expedition against Barcelona alongside Dukes Large. The defence of the planet rested with Colonel Franchetta Wong of the 5th Amaris Legionnaires, a relative of the first consul. The campaign, which began in April, was fought skillfully by the outnumbered RWA unit, but by early June they were all but beaten. But a reprieve came on the 19th when the news from Tharkad arrived. Duke Robert Denison, the Archon's husband, had sent her a personal communication. The first thing Viola heard after "your son has been kidnapped" was by the Dukes of Skye and Tamar. The Archon flew into a rage and suited up for a walk in her battle mech. Confused, her Royal Guard unit made ready alongside her. She could not go out alone into an active war zone after all, and soon they were marching overland towards the encampment of the Skye Rangers and Tamar Tigers. The 2 sentry mechs had barely enough time to register their surprise upon seeing the Archon before she opened fire on them both and then barreled her way into the camp. What followed would become known as the Day of Rage, and it saw the 3 regiments of the Lyran Auxiliary Corps turn on each other. The Archon could not be stopped from a murderous rampage, forcing the besieged units to defend themselves, which in turn forced the Royal Guards to defend their Archon. The carnage only came to a conclusion with the arrival of the Fusiliers of Orient, by which time the Archon was in a coma, the cockpit of her mech crushed by the fist of one of her victims. Afterwards, it was left to the SLDF and Marek auxiliaries to conclude the campaign on Barcelona, which they accomplished on September 18th. The 2 units from Skye and Tamar declared their intent to leave the task force, which the acting head of the Royal Guards could not decline after what had happened. They brought news of events back to the Commonwealth, and the situation devolved ever downwards. Task Force Taurus began the final phase of Operation Bull Run on April 2nd, 2591. Their fleets, which were arrayed around Flannagan's Nebula, began to push inwards. Each was tasked with suppressing one of the outer 4 worlds that orbited beyond the Hyades cluster. Every one of the thousands of interstellar objects had to be fought over tooth and nail against a desperate Taurian populace which had mobilised in their entirety to defend their homeworlds. Despite over a year of training, the 2 corps first tasked with breaching the perimeter proved insufficient. As few as 3 out of every 10 men and women could handle the mental challenge of sustained combat in a zero-G environment. The Taurians, by contrast, had a natural affinity for space combat and seemed to spend less time fighting the void, unlike the blundering SLDF who had to blast their way through the many asteroid fields. It wasn't uncommon for bits of space debris travelling thousands of kilometres an hour to kill soldiers, destroy shuttles, or even ships. By the end of the first year of the push towards Taurus, all other SLDF corps were training at New Vandenberg, soon to join the fray. Archon Viola Steiner Denison awoke from her coma in August, and by October had made up her mind to return to the political fold back on Tharkad. Around this time, word reached them of equally dire news from the Draconis Combine. On July 11th, the aging coordinator Heihiro Kurita had tripped, fallen, and fatally broken his neck. His son Leonard now ruled in his stead. Unlike his father, Leonard did not care about the Reunification War, and his disinterest threatened to further weaken Isaacson's task force. Operation Mailed Fist ended the year by assaulting Gotterdammerung and then Heer and Zatarum in early 2592, all three falling shortly after. Any hopes for further progress were dashed when Leonard recalled the entire DTMS Auxiliary Corps, leaving Isaacson scrambling to find new garrisons for those worlds. January 15th was the day of the crucial vote on secession from the Star League for the Lyran Estates General. Months of delays by the pro-Star League group had bought enough time for the Archon to make it back from the front line. With such an important bill on the line, every member of the Estates General and their steering committee was present. What they didn't know is that by this time the LIC was fairly certain as to who was behind the kidnapping of the Archon designate. As word started to filter into the chambers that members of the Lyran Intelligence Corps and the 4th Royal Guards were surrounding the Triad, certain members began to make themselves scarce. Anyone who fled was captured and detained, among them the Speaker Henry Graham. LIC agents pursued him back to his offices and caught him accessing a hidden chamber within which they found an extremely malnourished and ill Kevin Steiner Dinesen. As Graham was escorted out, the Archon approached in her still damaged Warhammer. She would never repair the mech's arm, nor get a prosthetic for her own lost limb. Graham stood defiantly as Viola passed summary judgment, raised her mech's leg, and crushed him underfoot. In the aftermath, all the conspirators were identified by Kevin, and the Archon disbanded the Estates General in perpetuity. Questions remained as to whether everyone behind the plot to leave the Star League had been arrested. The Archon's own husband, Patriarch for House Dinesen, had been implicated, but Viola had suspended the investigation prematurely, content to let sleeping dogs lie. Back on the front line, once Isaacson had resolved the issues created by the sudden departure of more than 20% of his force, he was ready to press on. 2593 would see the capture of Kruvder and Lakhov by the SLDF, plus Toland to the last remaining auxiliary corps, the Manics. Operations on the Taurian front were ramping up in 93. Onaga had now committed 5 of the SLDF corps to the assault on Flannagan's Nebula, all save for the 3rd Corps who had begun their training a year later than the rest. Even the Davian Auxiliary was getting in on the action, though they struggled to match their Star League counterparts, let alone the Taurian defenders. The fleet had succeeded in subjugating the worlds just outside the Hyades cluster, though no landings were ever attempted. Now they assisted in the continued push towards the heart of the nebula, all the while facing a stream of dropships and fireships boosting out to meet them. By the end of the year, the first line of defences had been overcome. The most formidable of these had been the Outland Gamma battle station, which had to be destroyed. Onaga had attempted to construct his own space station as a way of providing his exhausted troops a place to relax in an environment with artificial gravity. His troops were beginning to suffer the effects of extended periods in space and were overflowing the fleet's gravity decks. The Taurians would not give them respite, however, and hurled asteroids and nukes at the construction site until the effort was abandoned. 2594 saw 3rd Corps joining their comrades on their expedition into the Hyades cluster, but progress on the next line of defences was no faster, Taurian defence no less determined. Onaga took to rotating his units through cycles of 3 months fighting in space, followed by 6 months back on a world with gravity to recuperate. Even still, of those men and women who had proven themselves capable of tolerating the stresses of zero-G combat, somewhere between 40 to 50% would become casualties over the next 2 years of fighting. Things were moving towards a conclusion in the Rimworld's Republic as well. In 94, Isaacson took Anywhere and Bataraiji while Salaj occupied Benzinger. Apart from the capital, by year's end there were only 5 planets left. 2595 began with landings on Krelkor and Jatmin Boru. Steelton fell during the summer and Terran's World later that year. The penultimate conquest of Operation Mailed Fist was the capture of Vulture's Nest in early 96. Only Apollo was left. By now, the Archon had returned to the front with her 4th Royal Guard, but the fallout from the Day of Rage ensured that the Lyran Auxiliary Corps would not reform, nor would mistrust between the Commonwealth provinces ever fully heal. In many ways, General Isaacson would have been happier if she'd stayed away. Relations between the Archon and the Prince of Regulus were rocky at best and outright hostile the rest of the time. For the conquest of Apollo, each of the former battle groups would take on one area of responsibility. Viola Steiner Dinesen, as one of the Council Lords, had the honour of leading the assault against the Rim Provisional Government headquarters, much to the displeasure of Salaj, who was given the lesser task of rescuing Amaris. The first consul had been under siege in his compound for over 2 decades by this point. What his reaction would be to the Star League's late arrival wasn't clear. Isaacson chose to remain out of the fight altogether, observing and providing assistance from his orbiting fleet. Both ground operations began concurrently on March 21st. The Marik Auxiliary soon swept their way through the besieging Rift Republican forces and reached Amaris' compound. When the Rimworld's consul came out to meet his rescuer, he was not in the least bit thankful and treated Duke Narinda Salaj as an inferior, despite the fact that Gregory Amaris was somewhat of an irrelevance on the galactic scene compared to the extraordinarily powerful Prince of Regulus. Archon Viola was having a tougher time of things, battling her way through the perimeter defences towards the city of Terra Prime, where the Rim Provisional Government had made their headquarters. By the third day she had reached the outskirts, but was outnumbered by the 2 regiments of RRA forces within. Only with the arrival of the Marik Auxiliary Corps and the liberated Loyalist forces did she now have the strength to win the battle. However, the defenders were heavily fortified, and breaching those defences would be extremely costly in both machinery and manpower. On the 24th, she led a small detachment of her Royal Guards on a vulnerable patrol around the city, making sure her distinctive armless mech was well visible. The rebel units took the bait and charged out to engage the enemy commander. Unfortunately for the Archon, aid was slow in coming from the rest of her forces, and soon she was fighting for her life. By the time help reached her, there was almost nothing left of the 2 diversionary companies. The Archon was extracted from the wreckage of her Warhammer, but her wounds were serious. Immediately she was lifted off-world and transported back to Tharkad. Viola Steiner Dienerson died on April 28th, 1 day after arriving home. Her son Kevin was sworn in as the Lyran Commonwealth's 11th Archon soon after. Back on Apollo, General Nathan Isaacson descended from orbit and took control of the siege. The fortifications of Terra Prime were no less formidable, but he would not be as reckless as Viola. Over the next 5 months, he whittled down the defences until on September 3rd, the Rim Provisional Government surrendered. One of those killed during the siege, though the exact date is lost to history, was Catherine Dormax, whose actions in 2575 had begun the Civil War. She was one of the few moderates to have survived the many purges and coups that had characterised the RPG. Ultimately, her dream of a nation not controlled by a bloodthirsty tyrant proved fruitless, as control of the Rimworld's Republic passed back to First Consul Gregory Amaris. As Task Force Taurus entered 2596, Lord Damien Onaga began the process of transitioning his army back into ground fighters in preparation of what he assumed would be the bloodiest fight yet on Taurus. By August, all the outer lines of defences had crumbled, and now only the Hyades cluster was left. The 4 worlds within the cluster were all that remained to the Taurian Concordat, plus a handful that had been passed over beyond Flannagan's Nebula that by this point were well beyond reach. Defending the Hyades was the Taurian Guard Corps with 7 battlement regiments at its disposal. However, these units had seen regular combat over the last 5 years, and none were at full strength. Protector Calderon weighed what was left of our Taurian defence force against the approaching Star League juggernaut. Onaga had the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 11th, and Starguard Corps, 2 partially mobilised reserve corps, and the Davian Auxiliary. Furthermore, the campaigns against the Outworlds Alliance and Majesty of Canopus had concluded, and so the 5th and 7th Corps could be on their way. News from the Rimworld suggested that the 6th and 8th could soon be heading for Taurus too, if they weren't already. As Onaga's fleets overcame the final defensive ring around the edge of the Hyades cluster, Marshal Gisela Cardenas led the handful of warships that remained to the once colossal Concord Navy to intercept them, determined to go out in a blaze of glory. Ultimately, she got her wish, her sacrifice on August 7th going some way to absolve her of the loss at Robsart. On September 22nd, the first Star League warships descended into orbit around the Taurian capital, and Mirantha Calderon took the one logical option left available to her. She transmitted the Taurian Concordat's surrender. The Protector was still reasonably young, her people had been at war for most of her life. Though her decision to surrender had spared millions of lives which the Star League had shown no qualms about extinguishing, she felt a betrayer to all those who had already died. At sunrise the next morning, she took her own life. Her body was hurriedly cremated, and her ashes scattered into space to keep them eternally out of the clutches of the Star League. The Reunification War was over, and 100 million were dead.